we didn't have a government position. The government position was to have the referendum. That was the policy. And it was up to individuals to decide how they campaign. Now, as it turned out, I think about 70 to 80% of Liberal and National Party members who took part supported the monarchy, but a significant number didn't, including 3 people in the leadership group of the Senate, Richard Alston, Robert Hill and Peter Costello. And that was their perfect right, because they weren't going against a government policy. Australians are never impressed when they're told what they should do. We have a deep deposit of what I've always called Celtic scepticism. And when people say you've got to do this because it's the right thing to do, the head sort of goes up. What's he up to? We are very, very sceptical of people who say the nation will end if we don't do a particular thing.
It's not as if you weren't concerned about what was happening in the remote communities, was it? Because you demonstrated that with what no other government had ever done, that is the intervention.
Well, the intervention was a recognition that the Northern Territory government had completely failed in its responsibilities, and it doesn't appear as if a lot has changed over the 15 years that have gone by. And I think what emerged from the events in the Territory was a further indictment of the inability, the failure of the Northern Territory government to provide the basic services. I mean, you can make all sorts of changes to the Constitution, but unless you have a police force, you have medical services and you have an education system that is up to the task of helping the less advantaged, then you're going to have a failure of government. And that's what's happened in the Northern Territory. Some of the campaigners have lapsed to name calling and describing people who are against it as racist, and all of the things that the great majority of Australians are not. I mean, we have some racism in our country, and we have some racists. I accept that, and I think the treatment of Indigenous people in the past has been one of the great blemishes in our history. But this idea that our history is just a litany of racism and hostility to all sorts of minority groups is just quite wrong. Because it's so clearly wrong, it makes the average Australian angry. They don't like being labelled things that they are not, and they have every reason to be angry about it.
As we are being asked to vote in a few days' time, it says subject to this Constitution. In other words, whatever the Parliament does in the future, should the voice referendum get up, whatever the Parliament does in the future will be subject to this Constitution, and that means open to adjudication by the High Court. And it's my very strong view, and indeed the very strong view of lots of senior lawyers, that any constitutionally guaranteed right to be heard implies a constitutionally guaranteed obligation to listen on the executive government and the Parliament. And this is why, should the voice make representations which are, in the voice's opinion, insufficiently heeded by the Parliament and or by the executive government, it will be off to the High Court, and ultimately it will be the High Court that decides. Now, I think it was former High Court Judge Ian Callanan who said that this could lead to a decade of litigation. Well, I think it could lead to many decades of litigation, because in the end, anything that the Parliament does is subject to the Constitution, and therefore, in this instance, it would be subject to High Court adjudication. Contemporary Australia would not exist but for the British settlement of this country, and I think that the settlement of Australia has had a wonderful impact, not just on Australians, but the wider world, and for that we should be grateful. And indeed, Indigenous Australia is better today than it would have been thanks to the British settlement of this country.